Henry Bailey thought he'd seen everything, until a 6-year-old girl in a red sweater walked into his glass-walled office, handed him a handwritten resume, and said, "I need a job." Henry Bailey's morning began like most of his others, early, efficient, and structured to the minute. His luxury sedan pulled into the underground garage of the glass and steel tower he owned, and by 8 a.m. he was already in his office on the top floor, reviewing quarterly projections. His suit was crisp, his tie flawless, and his espresso untouched as he scanned emails with the practiced intensity of a man who had long ago stopped noticing how much power he held. His schedule was packed with meetings, calls, and presentations, and he had no intention of deviating from it. At least, not until his assistant, visibly pale and hesitant, knocked and opened the door without waiting for a reply. "Sir, there's someone here to see you." "It's a little girl," she said awkwardly, holding a small sheet of paper in her hand as if unsure whether to laugh or panic. Henry looked up, confused. "A child," he repeated flatly, expecting some kind of misunderstanding. Before he could finish his thought, the office door opened wider, and in walked the most unexpected visitor of his career. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her light brown hair was slightly tangled, her brown eyes large and calm. She wore a red sweater, a denim skirt, and scuffed sneakers. A small, worn backpack rested on her shoulders, and in her hands she held a single piece of paper. Without waiting for anyone to speak, she walked up to his desk, stood on tiptoes to reach it, and placed the paper down. Then she looked up and said, as clearly and directly as if this were the most normal thing in the world, "I need a job." Henry didn't respond immediately. He wasn't even sure how to. The room was silent except for the hum of the city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Slowly, he picked up the paper. It was a child's attempt at a resume. Written in large, uneven letters, it said, "I can clean. I'm quiet. I don't cry in front of people. I can help. I can learn." There were stars drawn in the corners and a small, shaky heart next to the line that read, "Please." He set the paper down, looked at her again, and knelt beside his chair. His voice softened as he asked, "Why are you here, sweetheart? You're a little girl. You don't need a job." She stared at him, not blinking, and answered with a calmness far beyond her years. "My mom is dying," she said. No tears, no drama. Just truth. The air in the room shifted. Henry, a man who had built empires and shut down competitors without flinching, felt his throat tighten. She said it like she'd said it many times before, like she had accepted it but refused to surrender to it. Her little hands were clenched into fists at her sides, and her voice didn't shake. "I have to help her," she added. "We don't have money. If I work, maybe she can stay alive." For a moment, Henry Bailey, the man who thought he'd seen everything, couldn't breathe. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because, for the first time in years, someone had walked into his office and reminded him what it meant to feel helpless. And yet, this little girl wasn't helpless. She had walked in by herself. She had a mission. And she had come straight to the top. He stood slowly, the paper still in his hand, and said, "What's your name?" The girl answered without hesitation. "Emma. Emma Miller." That was the moment his world began to change. He didn't know it yet, but nothing about his life, his company, his values, his definition of strength, would ever be the same again. Henry stood in the center of his office holding Emma's handwritten resume, his mind spinning with questions and 1,000 conflicting thoughts. The girl stood there silently, waiting, her eyes focused, her small frame completely still. There was no trace of fear or confusion in her posture, only determination. Henry had been pitched million-dollar ideas by industry leaders who couldn't command the room the way this 6-year-old just had. He sat down slowly in his chair, gesturing for her to sit across from him. She climbed into the oversized leather chair with effort, her feet not touching the ground, and folded her hands in her lap. He cleared his throat and leaned forward, keeping his tone calm. "Emma, do you know where you are?" She nodded without hesitation. "You're Mr. Bailey. You have lots of money. My mom said the people with money are the ones who can help when no one else does." Her answer was so matter-of-fact it left him briefly stunned. Henry glanced at his assistant, still frozen in the doorway, and signaled for her to give them privacy. The door clicked shut, and the office fell into a silence broken only by the sound of traffic far below. Henry leaned forward again, this time more gently. "Can you tell me what happened to your mom?" Emma nodded. "She's sick. She doesn't tell me everything, but I know it's her body. She used to be strong. She can't work anymore. And the hospital said it costs too much." Her voice was clear, as if she'd rehearsed these words 100 times. "We had to leave our apartment. Now we stay in one room, and she sleeps most of the time. Sometimes I make cereal for dinner." He felt something hard clench in his chest. He had grown up poor, but not like this. He had never been 6 years old and knocking on a CEO's door asking for employment. "Does she know you came here?" he asked softly. "No," Emma said. She would have said no. "But I looked up your name from a newspaper. I know your building because it's big and shiny and people say you fix things fast. So I thought, maybe you could fix this." Henry took a long breath and stood, walking over to the window. The city sprawled beneath him, vast and indifferent, and he realized how many people moved through it every day, quietly hurting, unseen. He turned back toward the girl, who was now swinging her legs slightly, her gaze resting on the bookshelf behind his desk. "You're very brave, Emma," he said. "Most adults wouldn't have had the courage to do what you just did." She shrugged. "It's not brave. It's just what you do when you love someone." Her words hit harder than she could have known. Henry's own past flickered through his mind, memories of walking away from people he'd cared about, chasing status, control, order. And here was this child, standing in the rubble of her life, still choosing love before fear. He knelt again, eye level with her. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's go see your mom." She blinked. "Really?" He nodded. "I'm not promising everything, but I want to meet her. And I want to help if I can." She slid off the chair and adjusted the straps of her backpack. "She's at Mercy Clinic," Emma said, her voice suddenly hopeful. "Room 12. She sleeps a lot, but I think she'd like you." Henry smiled for the first time that day. "Then let's go." And with that, he took a deep breath, grabbed his coat, and walked out of his office, not to a board meeting or business lunch, but hand in hand with a 6-year-old girl who had just rewritten the most important rule of his life: some things can't wait. The drive to Mercy Clinic felt longer than it was, not because of traffic or distance, but because of the weight of what Henry was walking into. He had spent his life surrounded by decisions measured in profit margins and performance charts, but now he was following a 6-year-old girl to meet a woman he'd never seen, driven not by strategy but by something deeper, an ache in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Emma sat in the back seat of the company car, her legs swinging beneath her, her backpack clutched tightly in her lap. She didn't speak much, only offering directions when asked, and spent most of the ride staring out the window with a quiet focus that Henry found both heartbreaking and humbling. When they pulled up in front of the modest clinic, there was nothing remarkable about it, just a gray building with faded signage and windows too small to let in proper sunlight. But to Emma, it was clearly everything. She jumped out quickly, then waited beside the door until Henry joined her. As they entered the lobby, the nurse at the front desk looked up in surprise. Henry was still dressed in his tailored coat and expensive shoes, a presence that drew attention, but it was Emma who stepped forward and spoke first. "Room 12, please," she said. "She's my mom." The nurse hesitated, then nodded, pointing down the hallway. Henry followed Emma past worn tile floors and peeling paint, each step heavier than the last. When they reached the door, Emma paused, her small hand on the handle. "She's really tired," she warned him. "Sometimes she doesn't wake up when I talk to her." Henry gave a gentle nod, and Emma pushed open the door. Inside, the room was dim and quiet. A woman lay in the hospital bed, pale and thin, with 4 lines trailing from her arms and a heart monitor beeping in steady rhythm. Her face was delicate, worn by exhaustion, but peaceful in its stillness. Emma walked straight to her side, placed her backpack on the chair, and reached for her mother's hand. "Mom, I brought someone," she whispered. "He's the man I told you about." Henry stood at the foot of the bed, unsure how to move, unsure what to say. This woman, Sarah Miller, had clearly been through more than most people could handle. Her skin was almost translucent, her chest rising slowly as if every breath cost her effort. There was a strength in her even as she slept, something unspoken that lingered in the room. He stepped forward and gently placed the child's resume on the bedside table. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said softly, "but I met your daughter today. And I don't think I'll ever be the same again." Emma sat in the chair beside her mother and looked up at Henry. She used to work a lot. She was a nurse. She helped people. But when she got sick, no one helped her. "That's why I came to you." Henry knelt beside the bed, one hand resting on the edge of the blanket. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And I'm going to help her now." The nurse entered a few minutes later to check vitals. She glanced at Henry, then at Emma, and seemed to sense this wasn't a typical visit. She whispered that Sarah had been holding steady for days but would need advanced treatment the clinic could no longer afford to continue. Henry listened carefully, asked precise questions, and when the nurse left, he stepped outside to make 2 calls. The first was to his personal physician, asking for a full evaluation of Sarah Miller's records and an immediate transfer to a private facility. The second was to his legal team, ordering a discreet financial arrangement to cover whatever came next, no matter the cost. When he returned to the room, Emma was resting her head beside her mother's hand. Her eyes fluttered with fatigue, but she looked up when he sat next to her. "Are you really going to help?" she asked. Henry reached for her small hand and held it gently. "Yes, Emma. I promise." He didn't fully understand what had happened that day, how a little girl with a backpack and a piece of paper had shattered his routine and cracked open a part of him he thought was long buried. But as he sat in that quiet hospital room, watching over a woman he didn't know and a child who had trusted him with everything, he knew this wasn't a detour. This was the beginning of something that would change his life forever. The following morning, Henry arrived at the hospital just after sunrise. He had barely slept the night before, his mind consumed by thoughts of Sarah and Emma. The image of the little girl sitting beside her mother's hospital bed had stayed with him like a weight on his chest. It wasn't pity that haunted him, it was responsibility, a kind he hadn't known before. Not the corporate kind that came with shareholders and deadlines, but a human kind. The kind that made you want to show up before anyone asked. When he stepped into the clinic, the nurses at the front desk greeted him with a mixture of surprise and reverence. He had already arranged for Sarah to be transferred that day to one of the private hospitals he funded through his company's foundation. Specialists had reviewed her file overnight, and a treatment plan had been drawn up with aggressive but hopeful measures. Everything was moving fast, but Henry wasn't interested in waiting around to let bureaucracy take over. He had watched too many decisions made slowly for the sake of process. This one was personal. This one would move at his pace. He walked down the now familiar hallway toward room 12, carrying a paper bag filled with breakfast, fruit, a muffin, and a small cup of cocoa. Emma was already awake, curled up in the chair beside her mother, her knees pulled to her chest. She looked up when he entered and gave him a sleepy smile, which, despite everything, still held the quiet power to soften him. He handed her the bag, and she took it with a small nod of thanks. Sarah was still asleep, her breathing steady but shallow, the machines around her quietly tracking each movement. Henry sat beside the bed and gently updated Emma on the plan.